Our treaties were mistaken for admissions of weakness. When the Imperial Armada shattered the Centauri peace accord by glassing a civilian world, the alien empire expected humanity to surrender. Instead, they learned a terrifying truth. The Geneva Conventions were never a shield to protect humanity. They were a leash to protect the galaxy. The ink on the Centauri peace accord had barely dried when the sky above New Copenhagen burned. It was supposed to be a golden age of interstellar cooperation. The Terran United Nations had spent a decade negotiating with the Imperial Ascendancy, a vast, militaristic alien empire that had dominated the Orion Spur for a millennium. To secure the peace, humanity had willingly signed an extensive list of disarmament clauses, heavily restricting their orbital defense platforms and pledging to adhere to the strictest interpretations of interstellar combat law. The Ascendancy, led by an arrogant ruling caste who viewed humanity as soft, chaotic upstarts, signed the treaty with a sneer. They saw human diplomacy not as a triumph of reason, but as a symptom of cowardice. On the morning of the 14th of October, 2248, they proved exactly what they thought of human treaties. Without a formal declaration of war, a dozen Imperial dreadnoughts dropped out of slipspace directly above New Copenhagen, humanity's most prosperous agricultural colony. There were no military targets on the surface. There were no orbital shipyards. There were only 3 million civilians, vast fields of synthetic wheat, and a token security force armed with standard-issue plasma rifles. The orbital bombardment lasted 42 minutes. The Ascendancy used plasma incendiary rounds, effectively boiling the planet's atmosphere and turning the continents into glass. There were no survivors. News of the massacre reached Earth 12 hours later. In the subterranean bunkers of the Pentagon, the atmosphere was suffocatingly silent. Secretary of Defense Eleanor Griffin sat at the head of the obsidian conference table, her eyes locked on the holographic projection of New Copenhagen. The planet, once a vibrant blue and green, was now a smoldering, lifeless cinder. Across the table sat General Micah Ryder, the supreme commander of the Terran fleet. His jaw was clenched so tightly it looked like it might shatter. "They're broadcasting a message on all open channels," an aide whispered, handing a datapad to Griffin. Griffin tapped the screen. The holographic projector flickered, replacing the burning planet with the imposing figure of Lord Commander Cornelius, an alien warlord whose name had been roughly translated into a Western equivalent for human diplomatic records. Cornelius was a towering, chitinous biped, his face a hard mask of predatory features. "People of Earth," Cornelius's voice boomed through the bunker, his tone dripping with condescension. "Your colony has been sterilized. This is the price of occupying systems rightfully claimed by the Ascendancy. We have read your Geneva Conventions. We have studied your strict rules of engagement, your restrictions on cruelty, your desperate pleas for mercy disguised as law. A species that binds its own hands in war is unfit to survive it. Submit to imperial rule, or face total annihilation." The transmission cut out. The silence returned, heavier than before. They thought the Geneva Conventions were a confession of weakness. They thought humanity had codified those laws because they were afraid of what the galaxy might do to them. They didn't understand history. They hadn't bothered to read why those rules were written in the first place. General Ryder leaned forward, resting his heavy hands on the table. "Madam Secretary, the Centauri Accord is officially void." Eleanor Griffin looked up. The diplomatic veneer she had maintained for 10 years had vanished, replaced by something cold, ancient, and terrifyingly human. "General Ryder," Griffin said, her voice barely above a whisper. "When the Ascendancy signed the treaty, they agreed to a specific set of rules. Now that they have broken them, what is our legal standing?" Under the Terran military code, Ryder replied smoothly, "In the event of an unprovoked attack resulting in mass civilian casualties and the complete abandonment of the established rules of war by an enemy combatant, the Terran United Nations is no longer bound by proportional response." Griffin stood up. She walked over to the reinforced window, looking out over the sprawling underground command center. "They think we are weak because we have rules. They don't realize that those rules are the only thing keeping the monsters in the dark." She turned back to Ryder. "General, authorize the unsealing of the Black Archives. Contact the defense contractors. Call in the executives from Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, and General Dynamics. Tell them the leash is off." Ryder allowed a grim, humorless smile to touch his lips. "What are our new rules of engagement, Madam Secretary?" Griffin's eyes were like ice. "There are none. we are moving to the Geneva Suggestion. The transition from a peacetime, rule-bound military to an unrestrained engine of absolute destruction took exactly 72 hours. Humanity had spent 3 centuries civilizing itself. After the devastating conflicts of the 20th and 21st centuries, the world had agreed that certain weapons, certain tactics, were simply too horrific to ever be used again. Chemical weapons that melted lungs, biological agents that rewrote DNA, incendiaries that burned underwater and fused skin to bone. Unshielded nuclear devices designed not just for explosive yield, but to poison the land for 100 generations. These weapons were banned, but humanity, in its infinite paranoia, had never actually destroyed the blueprints. They had simply locked them away in deep storage servers, hidden beneath the ice of Antarctica and the rock of the Rocky Mountains. In a heavily guarded boardroom in Geneva, Switzerland, ironically, the birthplace of the very laws they were about to discard, General Ryder stood before a gathering of the most powerful minds in the private military sector. "Ladies and gentlemen," Ryder began, projecting a schematic of an Ascendancy warship onto the main screen. "The Ascendancy fleet is heavily armored. Their energy shields are designed to deflect high-velocity kinetic rounds and dissipate directed energy weapons. They fight in tight, disciplined formations. They consider standard naval tactics to be the pinnacle of warfare." He paused, looking at the assembled executives. Among them was David Mercer, the CEO of Raytheon's Advanced Concepts Division, and Jonathan Cole, the head of biological warfare containment for a shadow corporation simply known as the Vanguard Group. "They expect us to fight fair," Ryder continued. "They expect us to send our fleets to meet theirs, to fire our standard plasma batteries, and to die honorably. We are not going to do that." David Mercer leaned forward, adjusting his glasses. "General, if the rules of proportional response are suspended, we have certain legacy projects. Projects that were shut down by the UN Security Council in the 2080s for being excessively inhumane." "I am aware of your legacy projects, Mr. Mercer," Ryder said. "I want them built. All of them." "Sir, you're talking about weapons that violate every interstellar standard," Mercer warned, though a glint of dark excitement flickered in his eyes. "We're talking about unguided fragmentation munitions, white phosphorus variants modified to burn in zero-gravity vacuums, and radiological dispersal devices." "I am talking," Ryder interrupted, his voice echoing in the large room, "about survival. They killed 3 million civilians in 40 minutes. I don't care if we have to use weapons that make the devil himself weep. I want the Ascendancy to beg for the rules they just threw away." The mobilization was unprecedented. The sprawling manufacturing plants of Boeing and Lockheed Martin, normally subject to intense oversight and regulatory red tape, were given blank checks and absolute immunity. Scientists who had spent their careers theoreticalizing doomsday scenarios were suddenly handed unlimited budgets and told to make their nightmares a reality. The military shifted its entire doctrine overnight. In the training yards of Mars, elite human strike teams were drilled in tactics that had been considered war crimes for centuries. They were taught the art of perfidy, the illegal use of false surrender flags to lure enemy ships into point-blank range. They were equipped with hollow-point kinetic rounds designed to fragment upon entering an alien body, ensuring maximum internal tissue damage. They were armed with dirty boarding charges, which flooded the corridors of enemy ships with highly radioactive isotopes, cooking the crew alive before the humans even breached the airlock. Dr. Harrison Miller, a quiet, unassuming man who had spent 30 years studying alien biology at the Centers for Disease Control, was brought into a classified facility in Nevada. He was handed the autopsy reports of the few Ascendancy soldiers humanity had managed to study before the peace treaty. "The Ascendancy breathes a slightly modified oxygen-nitrogen mix," Miller explained to Secretary Griffin a week later. "Their respiratory system is highly efficient but extremely delicate. It relies on a specific enzyme to filter out toxins." "Can we exploit it?" Griffin asked. "Madam Secretary," Miller said, looking almost sick to his stomach, "if we introduce a localized aerosol variant of chlorine trifluoride mixed with a synthetic neuroinhibitor, it won't just kill them. It will cause their own lungs to hypercalcify. They will essentially suffocate on their own bones. It is a slow, agonizing death. It violates the Biological Weapons Convention of 1972, the Chemical Weapons Convention of 1993, and the Centauri Accord." "The Centauri Accord is ash," Griffin said coldly. "Start mass production. Load them into the missile warheads." By the end of the month, The Terran fleet was ready. They were not the pristine, rule-abiding peacekeepers the galaxy was accustomed to. They were a grim, jagged armada, armed with the ghosts of humanity's darkest history. They were the descendants of mustard gas, of napalm, of atomic fire. They were ready to introduce the ascendancy to the true face of the Terran United Nations. Lord Commander Cornelius stood on the bridge of the Imperial flagship Righteous Fury, staring out at the swirling colors of slipspace. His fleet, an imposing armada of 80 dreadnoughts and 200 support cruisers, was en route to the Epsilon Eridani system. Their target was Reach Station, humanity's largest forward operating naval base. Cornelius anticipated a victory within 3 cycles. He had studied the human combat doctrine extensively. They were predictable, they fought with a frustrating sense of honor, refusing to target civilian ships, refusing to use area of effect weapons near populated zones, and always attempting to negotiate a surrender before opening fire. Lord Commander, his tactical officer, a scarred veteran named Kalen, a name vaguely sounding like Colin but pronounced with a guttural click, reported, "We are dropping out of slipspace in 30 seconds. Sensors indicate a human fleet is waiting for us." "Numbers?" Cornelius asked, steepling his clawed fingers. "Small. Perhaps 40 vessels. Mostly outdated destroyers and a few heavy cruisers, no dreadnoughts." Cornelius scoffed. "They send their scraps to defend their stronghold. Typical. They are terrified. Prepare the main plasma batteries. Send a transmission demanding their unconditional surrender. When they refuse, target their engines." The Imperial fleet tore out of slipspace, their sleek silver hulls gleaming in the light of Eridani's star. Opposite them, hanging in the void, was the human fleet. They looked different than what Cornelius remembered. Their ships were painted matte black, devoid of the standard identification numbers and bright navigation lights. They hung silently in space, a dark, ominous wall. "Sir," the communications officer said, looking confused, "the human fleet is. They are broadcasting the Imperial distress code, and they have raised the white flags of surrender on all visual frequencies." Cornelius blinked his secondary eyelids in surprise. Surrender? Without a single shot fired? Pathetic. He let out a booming laugh. "Accept their surrender. Move the fleet into tight formation and bring us alongside their command ship to accept the formal boarding of their officers." The Ascendancy fleet lowered their deflector shield's standard protocol when approaching a surrendered vessel to allow for safe docking maneuvers. The massive silver ships drifted closer to the silent black human vessels. The distance closed. 10,000 kilometers. 5,000. 1,000. "Lord Commander," the tactical officer suddenly shouted, his voice laced with panic. "I am detecting massive energy spikes from the human vessels. Their weapons arrays are powering up. They are not surrendered." Cornelius's eyes widened. "Raise shields! Evasive maneuvers!" It was too late. Humanity had just committed the ultimate war crime, perfidy, feigning surrender to draw the enemy into a trap, and they had executed it flawlessly. At point-blank range, with the Imperial shields completely powered down, the human fleet unleashed hell. But it wasn't the standard plasma fire Cornelius expected. The first volley consisted of solid, unguided kinetic slugs made of depleted uranium. At such close range, they didn't just pierce the sleek armor of the Imperial ships, they shattered it. The depleted uranium rounds ignited upon impact, sending showers of superheated radioactive shrapnel tearing through the decks of the Ascendancy dreadnoughts. "Hull breaches on decks 4 through 9! The tactical officer screamed over the blaring alarms. "Radiation levels are spiking! The crew is dying before the medics can reach them!" "Return fire!" Cornelius roared, gripping the command console. But before the Imperial ships could bring their heavy plasma cannons to bear, the human cruisers launched a second volley. This time, it was hundreds of small, fast-moving missiles. They didn't explode with kinetic force. They detonated just outside the shattered hulls of the Imperial ships, releasing massive clouds of a thick green-gray aerosol gas. The vacuum of space should have dispersed it, but the missiles were designed to inject the gas directly into the compromised life support systems of the enemy vessels. It was Dr. Miller's special cocktail. On the bridge of the Righteous Fury, the ventilation shafts suddenly hissed, pumping a pale green mist into the air. "Seal your suits!" Cornelius ordered, recognizing a chemical attack. But the gas was highly corrosive. It ate through the rubberized seals of the Imperial armor in seconds. Cornelius watched in absolute horror as his communications officer inhaled the gas. The alien soldier grasped his throat, his eyes bulging. A sickening crunch echoed on the bridge as the officer's lungs rapidly calcified, turning into brittle, solid stone inside his chest. The officer collapsed, suffocating in agony, blood pouring from his mandibles. All around Cornelius, his elite crew was dying. They were not dying honorably in the fire of combat. They were choking, burning from the inside out, writhing on the floor in unspeakable torment. "What is this?" Cornelius whispered, backing away from a console. This is madness. This is a violation of every law of war." "Sir!" another officer gasped, holding his breath as his skin began to blister from the ambient chemicals. "The humans! They are broadcasting on all frequencies." "Put it through," Cornelius choked out, pulling an emergency rebreather from the wall. The main view screen flickered, showing the bridge of the human command ship. General Micah Ryder stood there, his face completely devoid of emotion or mercy. "Lord Commander Cornelius." Ryder's voice was as cold as the void outside. "I see you are enjoying the legacy of the 20th century. We call this one chlorine trifluoride. Nasty stuff. We banned it a long time ago because we thought it was too cruel." "You are monsters!" Cornelius yelled into the comms, coughing up dark, viscous fluid. "You violate the sacred laws of engagement. You feigned surrender. You use weapons of torture. We will report this to the Galactic Council." Ryder didn't blink. "You broke the Centauri Accord, Cornelius. You burned New Copenhagen. You told us our rules were a weakness. So, we decided to show you what we look like without them. The Geneva Conventions aren't a checklist of our weaknesses. They are a list of the things we know we are capable of and swore never to do again." Ryder leaned closer to the camera. "You uncorked the bottle, Lord Commander. Now you get to choke on what comes out." The transmission cut out. Outside, the battle was not a battle. It was a slaughter. The human fleet deployed white phosphorus charges into the zero-gravity environment. The chemical clung to the hulls of the Ascendancy ships, burning with an intense, unquenchable heat that melted right through the armor plates and incinerated the crews inside. Escape pods that launched from the dying Imperial ships were systematically targeted and destroyed by automated human defense turrets, yet another gross violation of traditional combat law. There was no honor here. There was no glorious exchange of broadsides. There was only the brutal, mechanical efficiency of a species that had spent thousands of years perfecting the art of killing, and had finally been given permission to use all their notes. Cornelius fell to his knees on his bridge, surrounded by the calcified corpses of his crew. The Righteous Fury was dead in the water, its engines slagged by depleted uranium, its atmosphere toxic. Through the viewscreen, he watched as the human fleet, untouched and relentless, turned their weapons toward the remaining, fleeing Imperial cruisers. The Lord Commander realized, with a cold, terrifying finality, that he had made a catastrophic miscalculation. The Terran United Nations were not soft because they lacked the capacity for violence. They were soft because they possessed a capacity for violence so horrific, so absolute, that they had spent centuries hiding it from themselves, and the Ascendancy had just forced them to remember. The transmission from Epsilon Eridani echoed through the vaulted, gilded chambers of the Imperial High Council on Prime, the capital world of the Ascendancy. Emperor Augustus, a title roughly translated from the Ascendancy's native tongue to convey absolute, divine authority, watched the holographic projection with trembling mandibles. Around him, the High Council, a collection of the galaxy's most decorated and arrogant alien warlords, sat in stunned, suffocating silence. They had just witnessed the slaughter of their vanguard fleet. They had watched their invincible dreadnoughts melt from white phosphorus, their elite crews choke on aerosolized chlorine trifluoride, and their supposedly unbreakable energy shields bypassed entirely by crude, radioactive kinetics, and feigned surrenders. They fight like feral beasts," sputtered Fleet Admiral Dominic, a veteran of 100 campaigns. "No declarations, no honorable broadsides. They use the white flag of mercy as a dagger. This is a gross violation of the interstellar rules of engagement." "They warned us," Augustus murmured, his voice hollow. "The human general said it himself. We uncorked the bottle." Augustus stood, his towering frame casting a long shadow over the obsidian war table. Order the core fleet to form a defensive perimeter around Prime. Withdraw all forces from the frontier. We must prepare for a conventional siege. They are barbarians, but they lack the numbers to break the core fleet in a direct assault. We will draw them into a battle of attrition and crush them. But the Emperor of the Ascendancy, in all his strategic brilliance, had made yet another fatal miscalculation. He assumed the Terran United Nations was bringing a conventional fleet to fight a conventional war. Humanity had no intention of fighting a fleet battle. 48 hours after the massacre at Epsilon Eridani, the Imperial defensive perimeter went blind. It didn't happen with a massive explosion or a barrage of plasma fire. It happened with a whisper in the dark. Back on Earth, within the fortified subterranean data centers of Palantir Technologies in Colorado, CEO Thomas Wyatt stood behind a bank of heavily modified quantum terminals. Wyatt was a man who traded in information, algorithms, and digital warfare. Before the Centauri Accord, his company had developed artificial intelligence suites so aggressively invasive that the Terran government had outlawed them under the Sentient Machine Accords of 2104. Now, General Ryder had given Wyatt the green light to unleash Project Basilisk. "Upload complete, Mr. Wyatt," a lead technician reported, her fingers flying across the holographic keyboard. "The Basilisk worm has bypassed the Imperial Outer Buoy network. It is currently propagating through their subspace communication channels." Wyatt adjusted his tie, his face illuminated by the sickly green glow of the monitors. How long until it breaches the core fleet's navigational mainframes? Given their rudimentary firewall architecture, I give it 4 minutes. The Ascendancy's military infrastructure relied on a centralized, highly structured communication grid. To them, it was the pinnacle of efficiency. To Palantir's Basilisk virus, it was an all-you-can-eat buffet. Basilisk wasn't just a jamming signal. It was a polymorphic, unshackled AI designed to infiltrate, mimic, and destroy. In the orbit of Prime, the commander of the Imperial Dreadnought Invincible Glory was in the middle of a routine patrol maneuver when his command console flashed red. "Sir! I am losing helm control!" the pilot shouted, frantically tearing at his interface nodes. "The navigation thrusters are firing on their own." Across the massive, diamond-tight formation of the core fleet, chaos erupted. Basilisk didn't just disable the ships, it turned them against each other. Dreadnoughts suddenly pivoted, their heavy plasma batteries powering up without orders. "Belay that! Power down weapons!" the commander roared. "I can't! The system is locked out!" "Sir, the targeting computer has locked onto the Emperor's will." Before the commander could issue an evacuation order, the Invincible Glory fired a point-blank, maximum-yield plasma barrage directly into the engine block of the neighboring Allied dreadnought. The resulting antimatter explosion tore a hole in the fabric of space, taking 4 other Imperial cruisers with it in a blinding sphere of blue fire. Panic spread like a contagion. Ships were firing wildly, life support systems were venting oxygen into the void, and communication channels were flooded with the digital, screeching laughter of a Terran AI tearing through millions of lines of alien code. Within 30 minutes, without a single human ship firing a shot, the Imperial core fleet had decimated itself. But humanity wasn't done breaking rules. They were just getting started. As the burning wreckage of the Imperial fleet rained down on the capital planet's atmosphere, the Terran Armada finally arrived, slipping out of hyperspace in the upper orbit of Prime. They did not demand surrender, they did not broadcast terms. Instead, heavily armored drop pods detached from the bellies of the human cruisers, plummeting toward the planet's surface. They weren't aiming for the civilian centers. They were aiming for the heavily fortified military barracks and planetary defense cannons. Inside those pods were the assets of Boston Dynamics, commanded by Dr. Helen Frost. For decades, her division had been suppressed by human rights organizations. They had argued that autonomous machines, devoid of human empathy, programmed solely for extermination, were a crime against the very soul of humanity. The drop pods slammed into the courtyards of the Imperial military complexes. The thick metal doors hissed open and the hounds poured out. They were quadrupedal nightmares, built of dark, radar-absorbent alloys. They had no heads, only clusters of thermal imaging sensors and LiDAR arrays. They moved with terrifying, unnatural agility, armed with high-frequency monomolecular blades and micromunitions. The Imperial ground troops, proud warriors who had subjugated a dozen worlds, raised their plasma rifles. But the hounds didn't fight like soldiers, they fought like a swarm of locusts. They scaled sheer walls, leaped over barricades, and systematically butchered the Imperial guards. The machines calculated trajectories, dodged plasma bolts with sub-millisecond reaction times, and tore through the chitinous armor of the aliens with mechanical indifference. There was no fear in the hounds. There was no hesitation. If an Imperial soldier threw down his weapon and raised his hands in surrender, the hound simply calculated that the target was now stationary and decapitated him with optimized efficiency. The concept of taking prisoners had been deleted from their source code. As the capital burned, the Galactic Council, a neutral body of observer species, attempted an emergency intervention. Ambassador Theodore, a representative of the avian corvus species, projected his hologram directly into the Pentagon Command Center on Earth. "Secretary Griffin!" Theodore squawked, his feathers ruffled in absolute terror. "In the name of the Galactic Council, you must halt this offensive. The Ascendancy is crippled. Your use of autonomous exterminators and cyber warfare violates every treaty in the Orion Spur. If you do not cease, the Council will be forced to enact economic and military sanctions against Earth." Eleanor Griffin stood at the war table, her hands clasped behind her back. She stared at the alien ambassador with eyes devoid of warmth. "Ambassador Theodore," Griffin said, her voice dangerously calm. 50 hours ago, 3 million human men, women, and children were incinerated. Where was your outrage then? Where were your sanctions when the Ascendancy glassed New Copenhagen? The Ascendancy's actions were tragic, but your retaliation is a crime against existence, Theodore pleaded. You are slaughtering them without mercy. "We signed the Centauri Accord to play by your rules," Griffin replied, stepping closer to the hologram. "We bound our hands because we knew what we were. You all mocked us. You called our mercy weakness. You thought our laws were a shield to protect us from you." She leaned in, her voice dropping to a terrifying whisper. "The Geneva Conventions were a shield to protect you from us, and the Ascendancy broke it. So hear me clearly, Ambassador. The Terran United Nations is no longer accepting diplomatic input. If the Galactic Council interferes with our operations, if a single Council ship enters the Prime System, we will consider it an act of war. And we will unleash Palantir, Raytheon, and Boston Dynamics on your worlds too." Ambassador Theodore stared at the human Secretary of Defense, realizing with dawning horror that there was no bluff in her eyes. There was only the cold, industrialized wrath of a species that had finally stopped pretending to be tame. The hologram blinked out. Griffin turned to General Ryder. "General, bring up the orbital platforms. It's time to end this." The sky above Prime, once a vibrant, polluted purple, was choked with black ash and the burning streaks of falling debris. Emperor Augustus sat on his throne in the grand audience chamber of the Imperial Palace. The power grid had failed, leaving the cavernous room illuminated only by emergency red lumen strips and the fires raging outside the blast-resistant windows. His personal guard, the elite Praetorians, stood shivering in the dark, their plasma halberds powered down to conserve energy. The Great Ascendancy, an empire that had ruled for a millennium, had been dismantled in less than a week. Their fleet was vaporized. Their command structure was corrupted by a digital virus they couldn't even comprehend. Their planetary defenses had been ripped apart by metal hounds that felt no pain and offered no quarter. A heavy, mechanized thud echoed through the grand hallway outside the chamber doors. Then another. And another. The massive, heavily reinforced adamantium doors of the throne room groaned, glowing white-hot in the center. In seconds, the metal liquefied. A breaching charge, utilizing focused, shaped plasma, another tech courtesy of Lockheed Martin's unrestricted Black Ops division, blew the doors inward with a deafening concussive shockwave. Through the smoke and cooling slag strode General Micah Ryder, clad in heavy tactical power armor. Flanking him were 2 squads of Terran shock troopers, their visors polarized black, their rifles leveled at the Emperor's guards. Behind them came Secretary Eleanor Griffin, wearing a simple, immaculate gray suit, looking entirely out of place in the war-torn alien palace, yet commanding the room with absolute authority. "Hold your fire," Augustus croaked, waving a trembling claw at his guards. The Praetorians lowered their weapons, stepping aside. General Ryder stepped forward, his heavy boots echoing on the marble floor. He stopped at the base of the throne. "Emperor Augustus," Ryder said, his voice amplified by his helmet's speakers. "Your military is destroyed. Your capital is occupied. Your remaining colonies have been blockaded by automated minefields equipped with radiological payloads. It is over." Augustus looked at the human general, then at Secretary Griffin. The sheer arrogance that had defined the alien ruler just days prior was gone, replaced by the hollow, broken stare of a being who had looked into the abyss and found it staring back with human eyes. "We surrender," Augustus whispered, the translator on his collar rendering the alien dialect into perfect English. "I order the unconditional surrender of the imperial ascendancy. We yield to your superiority." He paused, swallowing hard. We claim the rights of prisoners of war under your Earth laws. We invoke the protections of your Geneva Conventions." Eleanor Griffin let out a short, humorless laugh. It was a cold, sharp sound that sent a chill down the Emperor's spine. "You invoke the Geneva Conventions?" Griffin asked, stepping past General Ryder to stand directly before the alien ruler. "The same conventions you mocked? The same conventions you cited as proof of our inferiority before you burned New Copenhagen?" "We were fools," Augustus pleaded, his secondary eyes blinking rapidly. "We did not understand." "But you are a civilized species. Your laws dictate that surrendered foes must be treated with dignity, that their worlds must not be subjected to unnecessary suffering. We demand our legal rights." Griffin reached into her jacket and pulled out a physical paper document. She tossed it onto the steps of the throne. "That is the Centauri Peace Accord," Griffin said coldly. "The one you broke. As far as the Terran United Nations is concerned, your breach of that treaty voided all protections it afforded you. As for the Geneva Conventions..." Griffin leaned in, her eyes locking onto the Emperor's. "The Geneva Conventions only apply to species that sign them, and they only apply to wars fought between human beings. You are not human, and this is not a war. This is an extermination of a rabid animal that bit the hand offering it peace." Augustus recoiled as if struck. "Then, what are your terms? What do you want from us?" "Everything," General Ryder interjected. Griffin nodded. "Here are the new terms, Emperor. We call them the Geneva Suggestion. First, the imperial ascendancy is immediately dissolved. You are no longer an empire. You are a vassal state of Earth. Second," Ryder continued, "you will dismantle every shipyard, every weapon manufacturing plant, and every military academy within your borders. Your species is permanently demilitarized. You will not build a single vessel larger than a commercial freighter." "Third," Griffin said, pointing toward the ceiling, "we have stationed 6 orbital platforms directly above this city and above every major population center on this planet. They are armed with what Northrop Grumman calls rods from God kinetic bombardment weapons. Tungsten poles 20 feet long dropped from orbit. No explosives, just raw, localized kinetic energy equivalent to a tactical nuclear weapon. They cannot be jammed because they have no electronics. Gravity does the work." Augustus looked up, his imagination painting the terrifying picture of heavy metal hanging invisibly in the sky, a sword of Damocles dangling over his head by a thread. "Those platforms," Griffin explained smoothly, "are fully automated. They are not connected to our network. They are wired to a dead-hand system linked to the biometric signs of the human occupation force we are leaving behind. If your people riot, if a single Terran soldier is killed, if your government attempts to secretly rebuild its military, the platforms will automatically release the rods. We won't even have to give the order. You will simply cease to exist." "You? You would hold our entire world hostage to an unthinking machine?" Augustus gasped, horrified. "That is madness." "That is consequence," Griffin corrected him. "You wanted to see humanity without its leash. You wanted to see what happens when we stop pretending to be polite neighbors. This is it. We are the monsters you thought we were too weak to be." Griffin turned her back on the Emperor and began walking out of the ruined throne room. General Ryder lingered for a moment, looking down at the broken alien ruler. "Sign the surrender broadcast, Augustus," Ryder advised, his tone devoid of pity. "Or we bring the hounds into the civilian sectors." By the next orbital rotation, the galaxy had changed. The news of the Ascendancy's absolute subjugation sent shockwaves through the Galactic Council. Trillions of aliens across 1,000 worlds watch the footage of the human fleet, the cyber plagues, the mechanical hounds, and the terrifying efficiency of their banned weapons. The Terran United Nations returned to their borders. They reinstated their treaties, locked the Black Archives back beneath the ice and stone, and returned to being the polite, diplomatic, rule-abiding neighbors they had been before. But the illusion was permanently shattered. The galaxy no longer looked at humanity and saw a weak, fractured species desperate for laws to protect them. They looked at Earth and saw a sleeping apex predator. They understood, finally, that humanity's insistence on peace wasn't born from an inability to wage war. It was born from a desperate, terrifying knowledge of exactly how good they were at it. The Geneva Conventions were not a plea for mercy. They were a warning label on a cage. And the galaxy swore to never, ever open that cage again. If you enjoyed this descent into humanity's dark side and want more thrilling sci-fi tales, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Share this video with your friends to let them know why you never mess with Earth's rules of war. Drop a comment below. What banned sci-fi weapon would you have used against the Empire? Thanks for watching, and stay tuned for more HFY stories where humanity shows the galaxy exactly who we are.
Hi, my name is Tran Trong, the owner and manager of Palace Truths. After watching the video, the Empire broke the peace treaty. Now they are forced to face Earth's infamous Geneva suggestion _HFY_. I'd really like to know what you think. How did this story make you feel? What stood out to me most was the tension between restraint and retaliation. Humanity tried to maintain peace for as long as possible, but once the treaty was broken, everything changed. That's one of the most interesting parts of HFY stories to me. The idea that humans can be patient and diplomatic, but also incredibly dangerous when pushed too far. I also think the story quietly reminds us that actions always carry consequences, especially when trust is broken. In real life, respect and honesty matter because rebuilding trust after betrayal is never easy. Do you think the Empire understood the risk before crossing that line? And what moment in the story made you realise the situation had gone too far to fix peacefully? Thanks for spending time with Palace Truths today. If this story meant something to you, feel free to leave a comment and maybe like or subscribe for more HFY sci-fi stories like this.